Hello and welcome back now to the next module in this Prince2 foundation level training course. Up until now we've discussed the basic structure of Prince2 and established some fundamentals in terms of understanding what projects are and what project management is. And it's time now to move on and discuss the first part of the Prince2 specific element of the course, which is to understand in some detail what the Prince2 principles are and how they are relied upon throughout the execution of projects to enable a project to be effectively managed using the Prince2 method. So the first question one should really ask oneself is, well, what is a principle? What does the word principle actually mean? Well, a principle is a fundamental value or belief, some type of standard or set of rules that needs to be applied and applied consistently throughout the project. To that extent, the Prince2 principles are said to be universal, meaning that they must be applied to each and every project in order for it to be considered a Prince2 project. Self-validating, meaning that these principles weren't dreamt up in an ivory tower somewhere, but that they have been developed over many years by the tens of thousands of organizations using Prince2 around the world to manage their projects effectively. They are effectively proven in practice. We also say that the principles are empowering, since they enable the practitioners of the method to shape how the project is managed by giving them the confidence or the authority, let's say, to tailor and adjust the method. But the Prince2 principles form the foundation upon which the themes and the processes that make up the balance of the Prince2 method are based. Let's have a look at all 7 principles now together, and then what we'll do is we'll explore each one in turn in a little more detail. So the 7 principles are: continued business justification, learn from experience, defined roles and responsibilities, manage by stages, manage by exception, focus on products, and finally, tailor to suit the project environment. Right, so those are the 7 principles then as a collective. Let's now drill down on them one by one and look at each in a little more detail. Before we start though, it's worth remembering or worth understanding that to get an idea of what a principle really means, in other words, what the spirit of the principle is, or what's the core meaning of a principle, a good exercise to set yourself is to say, well, how would I explain this management style principle in really simple non-management related terms? And that helps you develop a core understanding of what the real message is behind these principle statements. The first principle we'll look at is the continued business justification principle. So in Prince2 terms, what that means is that a Prince2 project should only begin if it can be demonstrated that there's enough business justification for doing so. That during the project we must continue to demonstrate this business justification still exists, and if it can no longer be demonstrated, then the project should be stopped. Now, that's much easier to say than it is to do, but there's a real tendency, and it's a human failure, to assume that stopping a project prematurely is indicative of project failure. That is true to some extent, but the real failure, in my opinion, is in allowing a project that is not worth doing to simply perpetuate because it started. So at the heart of its value, if you like, at the heart of the message here, continued business justification, in simple terms, means don't do anything unless it's worth doing. And keep checking that it's still worth doing, and if you don't think it's worth doing anymore, then stop doing it. That's as simple as you can put that as a principle. The next principle that we're going to take a look at is the second principle, learn from experience. Now, Prince2 project management teams will actively seek lessons. This will become evident when we look at the starting up a project process, when we first appoint the team. Those lessons will ultimately be recorded in the lessons log and used throughout the project for teams to act on them in order to improve project management going forward. Not only those lessons, but other lessons will be learnt during the execution of this project. Those will be collated as well and passed back to the organization. So in simple terms, learn from experience as a principle means look backwards at previous projects, either within the organization or even external to the organization, if that is possible, and look at them and look at the performance of those projects and ask yourself, is there anything that that project did poorly that we can try not to do again? And importantly, look back at previous projects and say, is there anything that that project did really well that we can repeat? And the more of the things that didn't go so well that you don't do again, and the more of the things that did go well that you can repeat again, the better the project performance will be if we embrace this principle of learn from experience. But important here to stipulate or to highlight that learning from experience during the Prince2 project is an active thing. It's not a passive process. It's not something that the project manager will simply sit and wait for lessons to be delivered to them and learn them as they go. The project manager will actively seek lessons before the project really gets underway and look to maintain this repository of lessons information so that at all times throughout the project there is as much meaningful information at the team's disposal in order to, again, minimize those failures and maximize the successes. So it permeates right from one end of the project through to the other. The third principle is defined roles and responsibilities. Now, all Prince2 project management teams should have a clearly defined structure in terms of a structure of accountability, understand which roles are reporting to whom and so on, and that's obviously important. It's also important to understand that the Prince2 project management team is a temporary organization. In other words, it is a structure of people who are operating in parallel with the standard organizational structure. The usual principles of line management and so on won't necessarily apply to the project management structure. But all three project management stakeholder interests, being those of the business, the users and the suppliers, need to be represented within that team. And there will be clear communication between all of the different roles in order to help deliver the project successfully. But in simple terms, defined roles and responsibilities essentially means that it must be explicitly clear for each and every role involved in the Prince2 project management team what is expected of them. In other words, what do I need to do on a daily basis? Whose responsibility might it be to update a particular register or create a particular report? That should be clearly defined. That allows me as a project management or a project manager or a project management team member to understand exactly what is expected of me from other stakeholders within the project. But importantly, also allows me to understand what I can expect from other people and other roles within the project management team structure. Here's a little diagram, or here's a little picture that helps explain the point. So here's a picture of an aircraft which has clearly landed without putting down the landing gear. And there the pilot is saying to the co-pilot, or perhaps the other way around, what do you mean did I put down the landing gear? In other words, well, whose job was it to do that? That's the spirit of this principle. Make sure that it's evident, make sure that it's perfectly clear to everyone involved in the project management team who's doing what, to avoid any of these uncomfortable situations where somebody thought it was their responsibility or somebody thought it was someone else's responsibility, and essentially an important thing, and that could be anything from updating a risk register or creating a particular report or exchanging important progress information with a particular senior manager, for example, doesn't take place because it wasn't really clear to those involved whose job it was to do that. Remember that all of this information will be defined. That word defined means written down in what we call, in Prince2 terms, a role description. So for each role in the project management team, there will be a role description. And it's within the content of that role description that all of the details of what that role is expected to do will be defined. It's further important to understand that the role description does not replace or override that individual resource's job description, because their job description will still be valid and that will still be a function that they need to execute in the main business. Remember, we said that the project is a temporary organization. In other words, for the project, they're fulfilling the role of the team manager or the project manager, whatever the case may be. And to fulfill that role, these are the things you need to do. That's the role description. But they will still have a job description, and that is their normal job in the larger picture, in the bigger organization. And that the role description in the Prince2 project does not compromise or override any responsibilities they may have in order to fulfill their day job. The next principle is manage by stages. In order to understand this principle, in order to explain this principle, we'll use a simple analogy. Imagine that your project is to deliver a snowman. And one of the things that we need this project to deliver would be obviously the big, large snowball that forms the base of the snowman. Now, in order to create that snowball, what we're going to do is start at the top of the mountain with a small snowball and roll it down the mountain. And we all know, as a snowball rolls down a mountain, it gathers more snow and it gets bigger and bigger and moves faster and faster. And the use of this analogy is not coincidental, because when projects get out of control and spending gets out of control and timescales start to slip, we talk about projects snowballing or snowballing out of control. And so this is a very apt analogy from that point of view. So we start at the top of the mountain with this small snowball, and we'll allow it to descend along the mountain till it gets to the bottom. Now, if we allow that snowball simply to descend along the side of the mountain, gathering more snow and more speed and more momentum as it goes, then we have to accept that when we get to the bottom of the mountain to see what's waiting for us at the bottom there, that what is given to us or what is available there for us to collect is what it is. In other words, that the snowball at the bottom of the mountain may be too big, it may be too small, it may be the wrong shape or the wrong size or the wrong density. It may have sticks and mud and stones and all things mixed up in it that we didn't really want. But what we haven't done is provided any control points along its journey. We've simply allowed it to take the trip down the side of the mountain completely without any intervention. Now, that's not ideal, because we want a snowball of a particular size and a particular shape and a particular density, and one that is delivered to a particular quality. In other words, without sticks and stones and rubbish and all sorts of things mixed up inside it. So rather than simply allow this snowball to transcend the side of the mountain here completely without any intervention, what we're going to do is we're going to break its journey up into stages. And by breaking it up into stages, we divide the total project, if you like, into a number of stops or a number of stages. At each of these control points, we can assess the performance of the snowball against a plan. So when we get to this point here, we thought, well, how big ought the snowball to have been? And how big is it actually now? That way, if the snowball is too big, we can shave a little bit of the excess snow off it and reshape it. If the snowball's too small, we can pack a little bit of more snow on it right here and allow it to continue along its journey. So by having these control points along the way, we're able at any point in time to stop, look at what we've done so far, look at what we expected to have achieved by this point, and determine whether this snowball is in fact on track. This will greatly increase the likelihood of the snowball getting to the bottom of the mountain and being something that actually meets the needs of what we need to do with the snowball. By taking this approach, we can ensure that when the snowball gets to the bottom of the mountain, that it's actually fit for purpose. In other words, that it actually will be suitable for us to use as we intended, as the base of our snowman. It's the right shape and the right size and so on. Now, what happens if we adjust, or what happens if we change the gradient of the mountain? What does the gradient of our mountain represent? In other words, let's make this mountain a lot steeper. So you'll see now, if this mountain was a much steeper mountain, you'll see that if we let the snowball go, it's going to get out of control and move a lot faster because the gradient is steeper. And let's make this mountain a lot shallower. So we'll flatten it out and see now, if we let this snowball go, you see that it doesn't move along quite as fast. In other words, there's less tendency for it to snowball out of control. So the question, I suppose, then is, well, what does the gradient of this mountain actually represent? And the answer here is that it represents risk. In riskier projects, we need more control. And so on the steep mountain, we would break this project up into more short stages. On a low-risk project, we would have less stages, but each stage would be longer. And this is because of something that we call the planning horizon. A planning horizon is a distance, in time terms, into the future that we can plan with some degree of accuracy. So in a volatile environment where exchange rates are fluctuating wildly and the availability of resources is almost impossible to calculate on a week-by-week basis, it'd be very difficult to plan a 3-month or a 4-month stage. Whereas in stable environments where factors are not quite as erratic, a 2 or 3 or 4-month stage might not be completely out of the question. So the degree of risk that surrounds us, to a large extent, determines the future time distance that we're able to create our plans. And Prince2 recommends that our project be divided into no less than 2 stages. The first, as a minimum, would be the first stage of planning. This will be our initiating a project process where we create the project plan and so on. We'll get to that in time, but the second stage would be our stage where we actually deliver the products that we planned to deliver. Longer projects will naturally have more stages because our planning horizon won't extend right through to the end of the project. With each stage comes a stage boundary, and so each of these stage boundaries provides a control point for senior management to assess whether the project is in fact justified. Going back to our first principle here of continued business justification, these are the points in time at which it must be demonstrated and re-demonstrated that the project is on track, that it has a likelihood of delivering what we want within the constraints of time and cost set upon us from the very beginning. Right, the next principle that we're going to look at is manage by exception. Manage by exception, in simple terms, is a principle that allows the project objectives of time, cost, quality, scope, benefit, and risk to be managed at project, stage, and even work package level. And this is achieved by providing for each of those elements of control something we call tolerance. Now, tolerance is a permissible deviation from target within which it's still an acceptable performance. So if my project is a 6-month project with plus or minus 1 month of time tolerance, as long as that project finishes somewhere between the 5 and 7 month mark, everyone involved should be happy because it's within its tolerance. And really, only when we forecast that the tolerances are going to be exceeded is it necessary to involve a higher level of management. So you can understand then that these tolerances that exist at different levels are what cause the level of management above those tolerances, if you like, to be involved. So a team manager, when work package tolerances are forecast to be exceeded, is required to escalate the issue by raising an issue to the project manager. If stage tolerances are exceeded or forecast to be exceeded in any event, then the project manager is required to notify the project board or to get project board involvement. And so at the next level, project level, the project board would need to escalate to corporate or program or the customer. If you imagine taking a long road trip in your own car, well, it would be a little bit frustrating and silly even for you to have to stop your car every 5 miles or so to open the bonnet and check the coolant levels and check the windscreen wash and oil temperature, walking around the car, kicking the tires to make sure everything's in limits. Now there's a reason that you don't have to do that. And the reason is that built into the engineered systems of the vehicle are warning systems designed to monitor those aspects of the vehicle's performance to alert you as the driver if any one of them is out of limit, if it's not acting as it's expected to react. Now, as a driver, if I get a warning light on my dashboard here to tell me that the engine temperature is climbing, I should be getting that warning from my vehicle with enough time to bring the vehicle to a stop and take some type of corrective action before I cause any damage to the engine or its seizures. In Prince2 terms, that's brought about by management by exception. And the key to management by exception is that we escalate exceptions to the next highest level of management when we forecast a potential breach of tolerance. Remember, our tolerances are the permissible deviation from a target. So back to the car, my engine temperature might have to be 120 degrees, and there might be a 5-degree tolerance either side of that. And as the temperature climbs, so the vehicle alerts me to the fact that the temperature is getting out of range before I cause damage to the engine. And in Prince2, we forecast breaches of tolerance. We predict them so that we can take action before they cause damage to the project or damage to the engine. So, in the same way that the systems in our car are monitoring the engine temperature, coolant levels, tire pressure, and so on, the Prince2 project is managed by exception. We constantly monitor different aspects of project performance, in particular time, cost, quality, scope, benefit, and risk, to make sure that they are within limits. And in Prince2 terms, those limits are what we call tolerance. This tolerance, if you like, is the permissible deviation away from a target beyond which we need to alert the next higher level of management. And to that extent, these tolerances exist at multiple levels within the project, relevant and related to the different levels of management within the project management team. Now, each aspect of project performance will have tolerance attributed to it, and the project manager will need to manage and monitor all of them at project, stage, and work package level. So management by exception is the opposite of micromanagement. It empowers each level of management to get on and deal with their own issues, unless those issues are forecast to take some aspect of the project outside of tolerance. And then it becomes mandatory that the next higher level of management is informed. One of the major benefits of this style of management is that it makes particularly effective use of management time. And we'll deal with this in more detail when we look at the progress theme. The next principle that we're going to discuss is focus on products. Prince2 is a product-focused methodology. What that means is that Prince2 says that all of the project's products, the individual components that are going to be delivered throughout the life of the project, should be defined clearly in the way of what we call a product description. Now, a product description is in essence some type of document that specifies exactly what needs to be produced, along with the criteria that this product needs to meet in order for it to gain approval. So, if the product was a pen, for example, the product description may record that the pen should weigh 20 grams, or that the volume of ink that it contains must be 3 milliliters. These are the criteria against which the finished item, in this case the pen, will be assessed to ensure that it is fit for purpose. Prince2 says that more successful projects are output-orientated rather than activity-orientated. Now, what this means is that we should first define what is to be produced before worrying about planning the activities required to produce them. Let's use another analogy really to understand that. So imagine that the product we're going to produce in Prince2 terms is a painted room. Well, it'd be quite easy to define in terms of a specification exactly what the painted room needs to look like once we're finished with it. Quality criteria will no doubt mean or be that there are no paint drips on any of the window woodwork, that there are no paint drips on the skirting, that the doors and windows are not painted, only the surfaces of the walls and so on. Now, creating a product description for a painted room will allow us, once the room has been painted, to inspect it, compare it to the product description for the painted room, and then determine whether what we see in front of us is described by the product specification. Commercially, the reason that's important is because the resource, the supplier who has painted the room, is expecting to get paid. And as a project, we will only pay them if they've delivered what we asked them to deliver. If, however, we decided not to define the painted room, but rather simply plan the way in which the room will be painted, We can create a detailed plan as to how many rollers we're going to use and whether we should put cardboard down on the floor or plastic down on the floor to protect it. And we can engage in long, meaningless conversations about how we're going to do it. But the point will remain then that even once we've done it, there's no real way at the end of that to categorically determine that what we see in front of us is fit for purpose or not, because we don't have a description against which to assess it. Define what we want first, and then plan the activities required to produce those products. The final principle is tailor to suit the project environment. This principle basically recognizes that although Prince2 is a well-defined universal project management method, it can't be applied straight out of the textbook to each and every project, because each and every project will be of a different scale, have a different level of complexity, have a different level of importance within the organization, and almost certainly have a different level of risk associated with it. And to deal with all of those variables, we need a unique method for each and every project. Tailoring the method means considering the circumstances of the project, looking at the textbook version of Prince2 and asking yourself, how can I tweak this? How can I change this to be more effective for my project? If we take a relatively simple project, a non-complex project, perhaps designing a new company logo or something like that, you may consider that this type of project may be very low risk. And we look at another project to build a nuclear power station. Now, this project may be obviously much larger in terms of scale and complexity, but also have much more significant levels of risk associated with it. If you had one set of rules for managing risk on all projects, you would find that in the simple project designing the new company logo, that the amount of risk management, the amount of risk reporting, the level of detail to which we would have to record and document project risks would basically almost bring a simple project like that to a halt. In other words, the burden of risk management might be so heavy that it really prevents that project from gaining any real momentum. Equally, if we were to apply the real amount of risk management required for that simple project to the project to deliver a nuclear power station, you might find that there's not enough risk management and that project would easily get out of control, and time scales would be difficult to keep to. The cost would almost certainly scale out of control very quickly. So it's important that the level of risk management, for example, is appropriate with the level of risk associated with the project. And this tailoring does not simply apply to risk, it applies to all elements of the project management method. But tailoring doesn't mean getting rid of elements of the method. It means putting your mind to the textbook version of the method and asking yourself, how can I make this work for my project? If my project requires a very formal reporting structure, then using the templates from the Prince2 textbook might be appropriate for things like highlight reports or checkpoint reports. But if my project doesn't need such formal reporting, and particularly at the delivery levels, then having morning meetings, for example, where the information is exchanged verbally, might be sufficient. Prince2 doesn't care what form those communications take place in. Prince2 only cares that the information is exchanged between the right parties at an appropriate time in whatever format suits that project. And that's what tailoring means. Tailoring means take the textbook version of the method and make it work for you. If you don't tailor the method effectively, the method will almost certainly risk non-adoption. People will simply not stick to a project management method that encumbers them in terms of, or prevents them from getting the job done. Can lead to either heroic project management or what we call it robotic project management. So robotic project management, very dangerous. The house is on fire. The fire extinguisher is over there, but the process says that I can't use the extinguisher until I got a report from someone else, so I'll sit and watch the house burn down because I can't simply do anything until I've got this report in from another level of management. So that robotic style of project management, which prevents people from dealing with situations effectively, we really need to avoid, and effective tailoring will do that. The detail of how the method is tailored will be captured in the project initiation documentation, which is created by the project manager during the initiation stage. And whilst we haven't got to this yet, this document is essentially a set of rules for project management. It explains how the project's risk and quality and change control will be dealt with, how the project team members will communicate with each other, where the stage boundaries are going to be, how people are going to talk to each other, the mechanisms for escalating issues and risks, and how the method has been tailored. And having a good, clearly defined section in the project initiation documentation that states how the method has been tailored will allow a project or a Prince2 project manager who's joining a project perhaps mid-term to spend a day or 2 days in the PID, in the project initiation documentation, and then get out there and hit the ground running with a good understanding of the scale of the project, the complexity of the project, the details around the risk of the project, and how the method has been tailored to deal with all of those. So those are the 7 principles of Prince2. Let's go through them once from top to bottom and remind ourselves of the simple, easy to understand meanings behind each one. Continued business justification. Don't start a project unless it is demonstrably worth doing. Keep checking that it is still worth doing whilst you're doing it, and if it is no longer worth doing, then stop it. Learn from experience. Look at previous projects and experiences. Reflect on those aspects of those projects which went well and those which didn't go so well. Use these lessons to avoid repeating the mistakes of previous projects and to replicate the successes of previous projects. Defined roles and responsibilities. Have an organized team structure and define each team member's responsibilities in a role description. Make these visible to the whole team so that each team member can understand unambiguously what is expected of them and what they can expect from other team members. Manage by stages. Break your project up into stages according to your planning horizons. And while you will have a high-level project plan, plan each stage in detail only when it is time to do so that planning has a reasonable chance of being accurate. Manage by exception. Define your tolerances for the project against the aspects of project performance. Monitor that performance closely and involve the next higher level of management only when there is a forecast breach of some tolerance. Give attention to the things which aren't behaving as they were expected to behave. Focus on products. Define all of the project outputs by creating product descriptions. Get agreement on these products before planning and executing the activities required to create them. And tailor to suit the project. Consider the unique requirements of the project and adjust the method to suit and complement the project. Don't throw the textbook version of Prince2 at each and every project, hoping that it will simply work. Well, I hope you now have a good understanding of the 7 principles of Prince2. Remember, it is these 7 principles that establish or form the foundation of the method. In other words, these are the foundation upon which the things like the processes and the themes rely in order to themselves function effectively together. And remember that principles, you don't tailor the principles. The principles are mandatory in all Prince2 projects. And you'll find later on, for example, once we've covered more of the method and we've looked at some of the processes, that some of the relationships between processes, for example, simply aren't normal or can't function normally if you don't, for example, manage by exception. And so you'll see that for a project to be truly a Prince2 project, all 7 of the Prince2 principles must be applied. Again, I hope you've enjoyed this module. I hope you have a good understanding now of these principles, and you'll need to bear them in mind and think about them constantly as we continue on our journey to understand the balance of the Prince2 method.